All right, y'all. Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 3 of my Bible reading journey as I attempt to get closer to God through His Word. So, where to begin? All right, yo, I have struggled to get this video out. Right, first because I was put on a tasking where I had to go out to Fort Cavazos, formerly known as Fort Knox. I was out there for a week doing some medical training, part of a joint emergency medical exercise. Right, it was a good time, but they had me working from 7 in the morning to 7 at night, and I just couldn't really find the time to really dig into the book of Leviticus, let alone make a video and actually, make it a worthwhile video. So I pushed that assignment to the right. Well, I did read some of it before I went out there, but then the majority of it I left until that task finished, and then I tried to make the video once I got back, but I realized that a lot of the things that I had read prior to leaving I had already forgotten, or I had forgotten in my notes how the context of the read was, and so trying to make that video was impossible because my notes didn't make any sense to me. So I decided to just give it another week and let's try it again. And then this last week was also very tough and so very stressful. And so I couldn't make the video, or I chose not to make the video then either. And so here we are now. It's Sunday. I'm now 3 weeks on Leviticus. But this is also the 3rd week of my video series. So probably not going to get done with the books in a timely manner like I had hoped, but I'm going to keep trying. So the book of Leviticus, what I got from this book is that, picking up where it left off in Exodus, right? The Israelites had built a holy temple, or a holy tent, right? Called the tabernacle, where they were supposed to be able to go and commune with God. At the end of Exodus, they had finished the construction, and Moses was going to enter the tent, and he realized that he couldn't. He physically could not enter into the tent, and therefore he could not enter into the presence of God. Now, the book of Leviticus is a set of actions that God enacted, that God took in order to right the wrongs that the Israelites had done, so that they could then enter into the tabernacle and commune with him, right? So the book is really broken down into 3 parts, right? One of those parts has to do with ritual cleanliness. The other part has to do with priesthood. And then the 3rd part, which is the smallest, kind of in the middle of the book, has to do with the Day of Atonement, right? So the rituals is broken down into 2 parts, really. Ritual practices that are to be done, and then ritual sacrifices kind of fall into that too, right? And what those what constitutes a ritual sacrifice, and then how to be ritually clean prior to, or in order to be acceptable in the presence of God, in order to be able to enter the tabernacle and be in his presence, right? So the first of those rituals was the ritual sacrifice, right? So when we think about sacrifice, at least to me, what came to mind was sacrificing something or someone for a to get something back, right? So I'm sacrificing this so that I can then gain favor in the eyes of whoever it was that I'm sacrificing to, right? And that tends to be the way sacrifice is used in many other religions outside of Christianity, outside of the Abrahamic religion. So what makes this sacrifice different, right? So these sacrifices are done not necessarily to gain favor from, but to say thank you to. So there's a sacrifice of thankfulness, right? So I was given, for example, uh, 10, healthy cows. I'm going to go ahead and sacrifice one of these cows as a thank you for everything that was given to me. Another type of sacrifice is a sacrificial atonement for a sin that I have committed, right? Um, that one was a little bit trickier, right? There are a few religions out there that will allow you to sacrifice as an atonement for a wrongdoing, right? In Christianity, we call that wrongdoing sin. And so it's important, though, to note that Christianity is separate, or it's different from those other religions in the sense that you're not sacrificing um, you're not sacrificing for payment of, right, to appease whatever that godlike figure may be, to gain favor from them, right? So this sacrifice in Christianity, at least in the Old Testament, is different because you first have to understand the characteristics of God, right? So I kind of spoke on this before. God is a God of love, justice, and grace, right? So in order to be a loving God, you also have to be a justful God. And so anytime there is a sin, there is a wrongdoing, that wrongdoing requires some type of consequence, right? And so God lays it out pretty straightforward. What's it called? The cost, or the penalty of that wrongdoing, right, is death. Because God is all about life. So if you go against the rules of God, or the way God intends you to be, right, that consequence is death. So that's the ultimate price for sin. And so what God has allowed us to do in the Old Testament, the Israelite people to do, is He has allowed them to offer up a spotless lamb, or a spotless calf, for the atonement of sin. And so what that does is that animal takes the place of you, and instead of you becoming dead, both physically and spiritually, all right, this animal takes the place of your spiritual and physical death, so that you can then be released of that sin, and now you can enter the presence of God. Right? So why is this even necessary? Right? So one of the biggest questions that I've seen brought up in a lot of apologetic videos is, if God is truly loving and truly just, why doesn't He just forgive you? Right? Why can't He just offer that forgiveness without the need for a sacrifice? And not to ruin the story, right? God always requires a penalty. He always requires justice, right? And so that the best way that I saw that question answered is that in order for Him to be truly loving, He has to punish sin, right? He has to punish wrongdoings. If you don't punish wrongdoings, then that word love becomes, it loses all its value, right? It becomes meaningless. You cannot truly love something and not desire justice for that thing. Should something or someone do an injustice, commit a sin against it, right? So God, being all loving, also requires Him to be justful, and so that justice, right, demands some type of payment. So all of this is done so that, all of this is an opportunity offered by God, so that we can then become righteous in His eyes, and therefore we can enter in His presence, right? It's important to note that God is the perfect example of holiness, right? And therefore, if we want to be able to enter into his presence, we also have to be made holy, right? We're not holy on our own accord, but we have to be made holy through God's uh, path, so that we have to be able to do what God has asked us to do, so that we can become holy in his eyes and therefore enter into his presence. If we try to enter into his presence, then without being holy, right, without being made holy, then we wouldn't be able. It wouldn't happen, right? It would be like two polar opposites trying to be in the same room, right? So think of fire and water, right? Those being two polar opposites. If you try to put them both in the same place to occupy the same space, one will ultimately overcome the other, right? In our case, God will always overcome us, right? And so God is taking steps in the book of Leviticus to allow us to become holy through those acts, so that we can therefore enter into his presence, right? So ritual sacrifice was one. The other section of the book dealt with priesthood, right? So first, a couple of Aaron's sons were ordained priests, right? And then and so their job was to be that connection between the people and God, and then God and the people, right? But he the book kind of does a good job of also showing the consequences of not following the ritual the ritual qualifications, because two of Aaron's sons did attempt to enter the tabernacle without first observing all of the ritual requirements, and they were destroyed in the eyes they were destroyed in the presence of God, right? Because again, in order to be in his presence, you have to be made holy, and they were not at the time, and because they were not, it wasn't that they weren't destroyed because of what they had done. They were destroyed because of what they had not done, which is followed the instructions of the Lord prior to entering into his presence, right? So they failed to adhere to that warning. And so it talks about priesthood in two senses, right? One, it tells you who God has ordained for priesthood, and then it tells you what those qualifications are for priesthood, right? The qualifications are very stringent. They're very what's the word I use? Stringent, right? We want to make sure that we have the right people in that position of power, or that position of holiness. And so it talks in great detail about what those qualifications are. And then the next part that it talked about had to do with the Day of Atonement, right? So the Day of Atonement, the Day of Atonement has to do with, again, the payment for sin, right? The justification of sin. And so what it's intended to be, the Day of Atonement is intended to be a day dedicated for the priest of that tabernacle to offer a sacrifice to the Lord for the justification, or for the sanctification of the church, the priests, or the entire body, the entire Israelite body of people, right? And a lot of the times, you can be a follower of Christ, where you live day to day, trying to follow in the steps of Jesus Christ. But because of who we are, right, because of our sinful nature, we are still likely to commit a sin along the way. And at times we commit these sins and we don't even realize we have committed them until somebody points it out, right? And so what the Day of Atonement was for the Israelite people was a day for them to identify all of those shortcomings, identify all of those sinful acts that they had committed within the last year, and then offer a sacrifice for that sin. right? And it talks in great detail about how the priest is to do to offer up those sacrifices. So, what this all means to me, right? The book of Leviticus was very well. I mean, it was a very structured book. It talked a lot about what how these sacrifices were to be done. It talked in great detail about what the qualifications for priesthood were, and it talked in great detail about how the Day of Atonement sacrifice was supposed to be handled as well. Right, the book of Leviticus was important to me because I grew up Catholic, right? I was baptized as a baby, um, but I didn't really follow the Catholic religion very well. I was a very, very bad Catholic, um, especially through my teenage years, right? But recently, um, I began to accept more of my Christian calling, right? I think the Christian religion, the Christian way of living life, falls a lot more in line with what Jesus intended in the Bible, right? So, if I am to follow Jesus Christ, if I am to claim the title of Christian, being a Christian, I think I owe it to myself and everybody around me to understand what that entails, right? And so one thing that the book of Leviticus did is it gave me a really good look as to, before I start judging people, before I start trying to give guidance, before I try to, you know, offer any type of instruction to anybody, I need to understand what is expected of me. And so, in the book of Leviticus, that gets made pretty clear, right? You are required to be uh, maybe more strict on yourself, right? Uh, that obviously God is a very loving, very forgiving God, right? And understanding that we will never be able to meet the expectation or live the life that Jesus and God were, or Jesus and the Father were intending for us to live, that sinful, that sinless, holy life, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't try. And that necessarily doesn't mean that because we have failed to meet that standard, that we cannot try to guide other people, on the right path. But before you attempt to do any of that, the book of Leviticus really dives into what you should be striving to achieve, right? And so, my goal moving forward is to be a little bit more regular in my videos, um, making them shorter. Again, I'm not trying to do a full breakdown or a full summary of the book, um, and I really do want to connect with what it is I'm reading. So, moving forward, that's my goal. Thank you guys for sticking with me, and I look forward to seeing you next week as I do the book of Numbers. I believe that's next. So, wish me luck and see you then.